Then Joy is also a very old friend of mine. She is a clinical professor in the departments of pediatrics and psychiatry at the University of Colorado in Denver. I think you started out as a pediatric clinical nurse specialist, didn't you?
Yes.
You continued on to become a pediatric and developmental psychologist and also an infant mental health specialist. And we're very happy to have you as a MidCap master trainer, an APIP trainer, and you're also very involved in many projects under this Wonder Babies program. And of course, you are very instrumental in the Gravens conferences. Since decades back, you have been chairing that together with Bob White, and they are so wonderful. Many of us have been there, and we are very extremely grateful for that. And also that you have taken the responsibility and the chairing the Gravens standard group interprofessional consensus panel for IFCDC. So please, Joy, tell us more about your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Bjorn. Let me get my screen up here. Is everyone able to join me? And I would like to, first of all, say hello to everyone. Let me just say that in looking through the people who are in the audience, many of you are friends, colleagues, both in the United States, Australia, and Europe. And I fondly say that it is typical that I have more friends in Europe and Australia than I do in the United States. So I'm so glad to see all of you. I'd also like to say that I am very impressed that Stina and Bjorn have gone from very little acquaintance with the Zoom process to being able to put on a conference like this, because I think that there is a very steep learning curve and you have mastered it beautifully. So we, yes, so we actually did this at the Gravens conference because you all were predicting that there would be a lot of difficulties with travel. And so we got you up and going on Zoom from there. And actually on the last day, there were 3 speakers who were restricted from traveling in the United States. And so we had to get them up and going really quickly on Zoom as well. So kudos to you for doing that. I think what I will probably do is stop my video so that you can see it. You can let it, so that if there is any problem with the internet, the video won't be the problem. So let me see if I can do that. Is that still working? If anybody could just say yes or no.
It works.
All right, good. So let me just say that this last Gravens meeting, which was the 33rd meeting of the Gravens conference, was our kickoff for the recommended standards, competencies, and best practices of infant family-centered developmental care in the intensive care unit. We have been, as a group, working very hard for the last 5 years on determining what we needed to conceptualize and then what evidence was available to make sure that people had guidance and recommended best practices for work in intensive care. And I want to stress that, is that one of our major foci is that it be all intensive care for babies and families, not just in the neonatal intensive care unit, even though most of the information about this kind of work comes out of neonatal intensive care units. So we were very pleased to be able to get this kicked off at the last Gravens meeting. We also were very aware that the IFCDC standards, the European Standards of Care for Newborn Health, was kicked off during the time that we were still laboring to kind of figure out our direction. And we're so impressed with the work that went into that. The work is now on the Notre Dame website. And everything that I'm going to say is there for you to take a look at. It is published by Notre Dame in conjunction with the 9th design standards that Bob White has chaired over the years. So if you wish now, you are welcome to go to this website, which is https://NICU-design.nd.edu/NICU-care-standards/. So on this website, you can access the standards, the competencies that are there to date, the rationale, the application, the evidence, and we are now working on links to articles of the evidence that we have been able to identify that will help you to guide other people to evidence that substantiate the guidelines and standards. So when you look at the contributing panel of members, I think you will see that these are, if you're familiar at least with the United States leadership in many different disciplines, they come from very influential positions in their interprofessional organizations. Joan Arvidsson from speech and language, Rose Bigsby from occupational therapy, Bob Chico from the American Academy of Pediatrics, Becky Hatfield, who was our parent support specialist, Michael Heinen, who represented the psychologist, but also is a parent of a baby who he had, I think, 30 years ago in an intensive care unit, and has done so much work on the stress for parents in intensive care. Carol Kenner, who is so instrumental in the Council of International Neonatal Nurses, Kathleen Kohlberg from Notre Dame, who is an expert in all things web-based, Jen McElroy, and Jane Sweeney, who are leaders in physical therapy, Raylene Phillips, who, and many others of these, who are representing the National Perinatal Association, which has come up with an awful lot of very good guidelines for different populations of babies. Erin Ross, who you all know because she spoke, I believe, at your meeting last year, who is a leader in speech and language pathology, and Amy Salisbury, who is really an expert in sleep and those kinds of issues, and Karen Smith, who was our NIDCAP representative. We also wanted to say that we included international consultants because we felt that we wanted a global perspective, and that these consultants would give us so much really good input in terms of their review of what we were doing and their ability to share with us their wisdom. We had representatives from Argentina, New Zealand, South Africa, Australia, Canada, Great Britain, Sweden, and then also in the United States, quality improvement representatives who really helped us make sure that we were on the right track. So we're really appreciative of the folks, many of them who also are in the NIDCAP family and were able to help us with really rich information. The honorary chairs of the meeting are Stan and Mavis Graven, who were the folks who really got us started on this 33 years of really exploring the science that support not only the environment for babies, but also the caregiving or the environment of care is what we call it now, for babies in intensive care and their families. So we're really grateful for their ongoing spirit, even though they're pretty retired right now. These are the organizations that are represented on the panel. And I think that, as you all know, the more you can get national organizations to be supportive of the effort, the more it is going to be much more acceptable to say these are standards and recommendations from these organizations, and we need to be very aware of their awareness of these standards and competencies, and hopefully they're taking on the ownership of implementing these recommended standards, competencies, and best practices will be helpful. I used the wrong finger here. We started 5 years ago, approximately, by just coming together and looking at why is it that we need to really concentrate on the rationale for development of these standards and competencies. So we started out with the assumption that there was inconsistent developmental practice in most intensive care where babies are hospitalized. And that's not just neonatal intensive care units, but also cardiac intensive care units, pediatric intensive care units, anywhere that a newborn is hospitalized. We recognize that there is likely a lack of standardization of practice among the disciplines, so that there are certain competencies that are defined by OT, by PT, by speech, by nursing, but there were not any standards that were across all of those interprofessional groups. We also knew that in many instances, disciplines functioned in silos rather than having collaborative practice, that there was a lot of variation, and probably still is, of care and communication to and with parents and family, that parents still, in many instances, are not considered integral to the health team, that parents are often confused, frustrated, depressed, and alone, and we're only now understanding more about the stressful nature that the intensive care unit, including pregnancy and perinatal periods, have on the mental health of parents. There's a lack of continuity from unit to unit and hospital to home. So we wanted to make sure that we addressed in all of our standards and competencies those aspects of what good care they get in the intensive care unit needs to be transmitted to those professionals who help them and support them once they get into the community. And we also recognize that to a large extent, there's a lack of community resources to support the baby, the parents, and the family at home. And that was very much brought to our attention when Livia talked a little bit ago. So we had a great discussion among all of these disciplines, all of these participants, about what is developmental care, what do we want to make sure is covered in our standards and competencies. We wanted to make sure it's infant-centered, family-centered, that it focuses on growth and development, that it's holistic, that it's system-oriented, not just piecemeal, that it's interprofessional, collaborative, and really all of the above, which are really essential to being able to deliver optimal care to babies, no matter what kind of situation they're in hospitals. So we took a long time to talk about our concept model, and we really agreed, and we have been informed by a large body of evidence about the importance of individualized care, that every baby and family are unique and need specific interventions that meet their particular needs, that family involvement is paramount, both in the teams, but also in their baby's care, that there is environmental protection, that we know so much more about the impact of the environment on the developing baby and family, that there is neuroprotection of the developing brain that so many of the speakers have spoken so eloquently about, and that infant mental health principles are infused. That is a main focus of developing that relationship-based support for families as they interact with their babies, staff as they interact with families, and so on. We also know that the baby is a competent communicator and interactor, very much emphasized by the NIDCAP work, and that systems thinking is so important when we are really working in complex adaptive systems. So Carol Kenner and Carol Jager have been very instrumental in making sure that we have a major emphasis on, once you have this information, how do you adapt the system to be able to make sure that it is continued, not just immediately, but later on. Another really important thing that we talked about early on was, how do we describe the baby? And that is, we describe the baby in the context of the baby mother dyad. And the acronym that we have used is the baby and the mother. And sometimes the mother is the other, the father, the grandparent, the foster parent, and so forth. So we wanted to model these standards and competencies and define what it is that we're trying to get at. So the standard we defined as an expectation of what the practice needs to be, and the competency is the behavior of practice that hopefully can be measurable. In our next steps, what we're going to be looking at is the process of, how do you take the standards and recommendations and weave it into the current culture? How do you evaluate it? How do you educate people? How do you implement it? How do you evaluate it? And so forth. And that's going to be in our next steps. But let me just tell you how we went about this. The first thing we decided to do was search the literature for appropriate evidence. So we have reviewed systematically over 1,000 articles, studies from Medline, CINAHL, the Web of Science, the Cochrane databases. References were selected as appropriate to our goal of developing evidence-based standards and competencies. We came up with over 500 that have been published within the past 10 years and include classic studies that are relevant to any of the topics that we addressed. That we decided that we wanted to also understand the level of evidence. The meta-analysis, RCTs, systematic reviews, the majority of the studies available as evidence were descriptive. But that then we put it into a table of strength of evidence, whether it's A, B, C, or D, and that was determined by committee consensus to be strong. So the levels of evidence as outlined by Melnick and Fineout over Holt were used, and the strength of the recommendations were based on the quality of supporting evidence using the Oxford Center grades of recommendations that I'll show you in just a minute. We also had feedback from 250 parents and professionals. These were mostly people who attended the Gravens meetings, and over the last 3 years, we have afforded them the opportunity to see where we are with the work, to give us specific feedback about what needed to be incorporated, what needed to be emphasized, what needed to be deleted. And we also used expert interprofessional reviewers who knew the literature and could give us feedback, and we're really appreciative of their contributions. So you will find on the web the strength of evidence by grade, and you may not be able to see this very well, but we used as exemplars certain areas that we knew that there was some evidence around. And we'll talk more specifically about that in just a minute. But as you can see, this is the indication of the standard, and then this is the indication of the grade that was given. So overall, the levels of evidence for IFCDC best practice standards and competencies are moderate to low, though the composite strength of the evidence for each standard and competency was considered by the committee experts to be strong. There are limited studies that are experimentally designed, randomized controlled trials to support the clinical guidelines, practice standards, and performance competencies. So we know that more in-depth and very carefully designed research studies are necessary. So the top subtopic areas that we wanted to make sure that we used as examples in applying our model to were firstly systems thinking and complex adaptive systems. That is, what kind of system standards and recommendations need to be there in order for the implementation of what we are recommending. The second is reducing and managing pain and stress, not only in the newborns, but also in their families. The third is positioning and touch for the newborn in intensive care. The fourth is sleep and arousal interventions for the newborn. The fifth is skin-to-skin contact with intimate family members. And lastly, but certainly, probably most extensively, because there is a huge body of literature on feeding, eating, and nutrition delivery. So how we approach the integration of the parental perspective into each of these was that the consensus committee chose to illustrate the integration of parents through descriptive statements that help professionals to imagine what it's like to be them. So for example, and using Diane Moroney's really lovely Imagine work that she has been doing over 20 or 30 years, an example is, imagine having one single event, your child's birth, be the cause for celebrating the best and the worst day of your life. And certainly we heard Livia talking about when she actually felt like a mother and some of the challenges that she had, which really makes it difficult to both celebrate and realize that you're in this for the long haul. So I thought I would just share with you some examples of standards and competencies in each of these areas. So for example, and you can certainly take a more in-depth look at these on the website, which is, by the way, will be continuously improved and made a little bit more accessible, but we wanted to get it out for people. Systems thinking in complex adaptive systems. So one of the standards in that particular section is that the intensive care unit practice and outcomes will provide evidence that demonstrates a continuous monitoring of information relative to IFCDC practice. So a competency that follows from that is improvement initiatives and resulting neonatal health outcomes shall be monitored, evaluated, and communicated. I was really happy to hear Charlotte talk about many of the quality improvement projects that they have started at Qatar. The second one is reducing and managing pain and stress in newborns and families. We had this broken down into two. One is the families and the other is the infant. So for the families, an example of the standard is the interprofessional team shall document increased parental caregiver well-being and decreased emotional distress during the intensive care hospital stay. Distress levels of baby siblings and extended family should also be considered. This is pretty new to our hospitals in the United States, I believe, because there is not, to my knowledge, a widespread measurement of emotional distress either in NICUs or in other intensive care units where babies are hospitalized. So competency would be well-being and emotional distress shall be evaluated within 72 hours of admission and 48 hours before discharge, as well as other times indicated by clinical judgment. So I think this will be pause for thought for a number of people who have not really addressed the needs of families in the intensive care unit. The second part of this particular standard is for babies. The interprofessional team shall develop practices that prioritize multiple methods to optimize baby outcomes by minimizing impact of stressful and painful stimuli. It was so important for me to hear Rosario's talk about the importance of touch and with the newborn, and especially by their mothers. So the competency, then one of them comes out. Families should be included in the development of protocols for assessment and management of neonatal pain and stress. And these protocols shall be readily available to interprofessionals. The next one is positioning and touch for the newborn. And one of the standards says, babies in intensive care settings shall be positioned to support musculoskeletal, physiological, and behavioral stability. And the competency is body position shall be individualized and monitored for head, trunk, and extremity alignment and movement. The next one has to do with sleep and arousal interventions for the newborn. And an example standard is intensive care units shall promote developmentally appropriate sleep and arousal states and sleep-wake cycles. The competency associated with that particular standard, the ICU policies and procedures shall support stable states of arousal to optimize interaction, assessment, and feeding. In terms of skin to skin, and this is a very large section of the standards, so I'm giving you just a real little taste of what the standards and competencies look like. But one is parents shall be encouraged and supported in early, frequent, and prolonged skin to skin contact with their babies. And the competency associated with one of the competencies is parents shall be supported to recognize their baby's behavioral communication of stress and relaxation during skin-to-skin care. So there are an awful lot of other evidence-based competencies associated with those standards. And then examples of standards and competencies for the management of feeding, eating, and nutrition delivery. And I think I already mentioned that it is a very large section. And in my conversations with Joan Arbertson and Aaron Ross, I believe that in the future we're going to be separating it out into feeding experiences, breastfeeding, nutrition, because there is so much there. So an example is standard one, feeding experiences in the intensive care unit shall be behavior-based and baby-led. Baby-led principles are similar whether applied to enteral, breast, or bottle feeding experience. And so a competency is consistency of feeding practices among staff who feed an infant shall be promoted, monitored, and verified. So we recognize that this is only our first step. There is such a need for more research, study, and evidence-based improvement dissemination with really good design models. And we look to those of you who are the audience as well as others for really developing, implementing our next wave of research on any of these topics and more. Sharing of implementation practices improvement, which is plan, do, study, act, work, and metrics with the committee. That is in the process that we're encouraging people to go through once they have gotten over the understanding that these standards and evidence-based competencies are available to them. How do they go back what are their challenges with implementation? What further practice examples do they need? To monitor the standardization of IFCDC practice in ICUs from unit to unit. And we will be reviewing, revising, and adding new evidence that comes in on almost a daily basis to help us to shore up why and validate why we are recommending these standards and competencies. So the process that we're introducing, we have started with the standards and competencies. And what we want people to go back and do is to think about the vision and the culture with which they are trying to implement these standards and competencies. What are their planning steps? What kind of education do they do? How do they implement it? How do they evaluate it? And how can this be sustained on a long-term basis? So we have a lot of work ahead of us. I would encourage you to use whatever information is on the website. There will also be an article, which is an expert review of the background and implementation of the standards and competencies in the Journal of Perinatology Supplement. It is in press, we hope. There's been a delay, and we were hoping that would come out simultaneously with what is on the web, but stay tuned because it will be available pretty soon. And we would also like to acknowledge those people who made it much more easy for us as a panel to get together, to garner information, to use the insights of parents, and to be able to really have more of a holistic view of what we were trying to do. Carol Jager is the mastermind, I must say, of all of this. She is much more organized than I am. She has been a guiding light to our panel and has just been absolutely fantastic. So feel free to contact either of us if you have any questions. And we will also be readdressing this, I'm sure, at the next Gravens conference, and we would really love to have you. I don't know whether it's going to be virtual or whether you would like to come and experience the beach with us. So thank you very much.